The end of the petrodollar. Most aren't ready. Something is collapsing right now, quietly, systematically, and almost entirely out of view of the mainstream news cycle. It has no explosion, no single dramatic moment, no declaration of war. And yet what is unfolding across the global financial system in this decade may represent the most consequential geopolitical shift since the end of World War II. The petrodollar system, a 50-year architecture that gave the United States unparalleled economic dominance over every nation on Earth, is fracturing. Not collapsing overnight, not disappearing by Friday, but fracturing. And the difference between those two things is everything, because a slow fracture is far more dangerous than a sudden break. A sudden break triggers alarms. A slow fracture goes unnoticed until the structure can no longer hold its own weight. Here is what we know with certainty. Saudi Arabia, the nation whose 1974 agreement with the United States gave birth to the petrodollar system, has now formally opened oil trade settlements in currencies other than the US dollar. China, the world's largest oil importer, is purchasing Saudi crude in yuan. The BRICS coalition, representing nations that collectively account for over 40% of global GDP, has accelerated negotiations toward a new reserve currency framework. And the IMF itself has quietly warned member states to begin stress testing their dollar dependency. These are not rumors. These are not fringe theories circulated on financial blogs. These are documented, verifiable developments, tracked by the world's most serious intelligence agencies, debated behind closed doors at the highest levels of the U.S. Treasury, and studied with growing alarm at institutions from the Brookings Institution to the Council on Foreign Relations. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous for ordinary citizens is precisely how invisible it remains to most people. When oil prices spike, people feel it at the pump. When stock markets crash, people see it on their screens. But when the underlying architecture of global dollar dominance begins to erode, there is no immediate signal. No alarm sounds. Life continues as normal until it doesn't. The petrodollar was never just about oil. It was about control. Control over who could participate in global trade, who could access credit, and which nation's decisions shaped the economic reality of every other nation on Earth. For 50 years, that nation was the United States. And the mechanism that made it possible was a single, seemingly simple agreement. Oil would be priced and sold in dollars, and dollars alone. That agreement is now under sustained, coordinated, and accelerating challenge. In this documentary, we are going to trace exactly how this system was built, why it is now breaking, and what the geopolitical consequences are for global power, regional stability, and the daily financial lives of hundreds of millions of people who have never heard the word petrodollar in their lives. Because the end of the petrodollar is not a financial story, it is a geopolitical story. It is a story about power, who holds it, who is challenging it, and what the world looks like when the answer to that question begins to change. If you follow serious geopolitical analysis and want to understand the forces actually shaping the world right now, not the noise but the signal, subscribe to this channel now. What we are covering in this documentary is not speculation. It is the present, documented reality that most mainstream outlets have yet to fully reckon with. The story begins 50 years ago, in a desert kingdom, in the aftermath of a war that nearly broke the global economy. To understand why the petrodollar system is fracturing today, you have to understand why it was built in the first place, and how desperate the circumstances were that forced its creation. The story begins not in 1974, but 3 years earlier. August 15th, 1971. On that date, President Richard Nixon walked into a television studio and made an announcement that would quietly reshape every economy on Earth. The United States, he declared, would no longer allow foreign governments to convert US dollars into gold. The Bretton Woods system, the post-World War II framework that had pegged the dollar to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, was over. Unilaterally, immediately, without international negotiation. The world had just been handed a dollar that was backed by nothing except the promise of the United States government. This moment, known in financial history as the Nixon Shock, created an immediate and existential crisis. If the dollar was no longer tied to gold, why would any nation continue to hold it as their primary reserve currency? Why would countries price their exports in dollars? What gave the dollar its value? Washington needed an answer, and it needed one fast. 1973, the oil embargo. The Yom Kippur War erupted in October 1973. Arab members of OPEC, furious at US support for Israel, imposed a total oil embargo on the United States and several Western allies. Oil prices quadrupled almost overnight. Petrol queues stretched for miles across American cities. The US economy lurched into stagflation, the toxic combination of high inflation and stagnant growth that economists had previously believed impossible. The embargo lasted 5 months, but its strategic lesson lasted 50 years. It revealed two things simultaneously. First, that oil was the single most important commodity in the global economy, the energy source upon which every industry, every military, and every government depended. Second, that whoever controlled oil pricing controlled something close to economic sovereignty itself. 1974. The Petrodollar Agreement. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger traveled to Riyadh. The negotiations that followed were conducted largely in secret, and their full terms were not declassified by the US Treasury until 2016. The outline, however, was straightforward in its genius. Saudi Arabia would agree to price all of its oil exports exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would provide Saudi Arabia with military protection, including arms sales, security guarantees, and a permanent US military presence in the Gulf region. Additionally, the surplus dollars that Saudi Arabia accumulated, the petrodollars, would be recycled back into the US economy through the purchase of US Treasury bonds. The arrangement was extended to the broader OPEC cartel within months. The implications were staggering. Every nation on Earth that needed oil, which was every nation on Earth, now needed US dollars to buy it. This created a permanent, structural, global demand for the dollar. Nations accumulated dollar reserves not because they trusted the United States unconditionally, but because they had no operational choice. The dollar was the price of admission to the global energy market. And because those dollars flowed back into US Treasury bonds, the United States gained something no other nation in history had possessed: the ability to run persistent fiscal deficits financed by the rest of the world. America could spend more than it earned, indefinitely, because global demand for dollars meant global demand for American debt. The decades that followed. From 1974 through the 1990s, the system functioned largely as designed. Oil-producing nations accumulated vast dollar reserves. Developing economies pegged their currencies to the dollar. The IMF and World Bank, institutions dominated by Washington, extended dollar-denominated loans across the developing world, embedding dollar dependency into the infrastructure of global finance. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 appeared to cement US dominance permanently. The dollar had no serious rival. The euro, launched in 1999, absorbed some reserve diversification, but it was itself a Western currency operating within a framework broadly compatible with US interests. Then came 2003, then 2008, then 2022. The Iraq War damaged US credibility across the Middle East and fractured the coalition of nations that had accepted American military leadership as part of the petrodollar bargain. The 2008 financial crisis, originating inside US financial institutions, demonstrated that dollar-denominated assets were not the safe harbor the system had promised. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, followed immediately by the freezing of approximately $300 billion in Russian sovereign reserves held in Western institutions, sent a message that reverberated in every finance ministry, from Beijing to Riyadh to New Delhi. The message was simple, and it was devastating to the system's credibility. Dollar reserves could be seized. That realization accelerated a process of de-dollarisation that had been building quietly for years, and transformed it into something far more urgent. The fracturing of the petrodollar system did not happen in a single moment. It happened in a sequence of deliberate, documented decisions, made by sovereign governments, central banks, and multilateral institutions, each one individually significant and collectively representing a structural challenge to 50 years of dollar dominance. Understanding what is actually happening requires separating confirmed fact from contested interpretation. Both matter, and both must be examined precisely. What is confirmed? In March 2023, Saudi Arabia's finance minister, Mohammed al-Jadaan, made a statement at the World Economic Forum in Davos that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The kingdom, he said, was open to settling oil trades in currencies other than the US dollar. This was not a casual remark. It was a carefully prepared, diplomatically calibrated signal, delivered on one of the world's most visible stages. Within weeks, the first yuan-denominated LNG trade was settled between China and France's Total Energies through the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange. It was a relatively small transaction in volume, but its symbolic weight was enormous. For the first time, a major Western energy company had participated in a non-dollar oil settlement on Chinese infrastructure. China and Brazil simultaneously announced a bilateral trade agreement to conduct transactions directly in yuan and reais, bypassing the dollar entirely. The agreement covered not only commodities, but manufactured goods, a significant expansion beyond the energy sector where de-dollarisation had previously been concentrated. India, which has become the world's third-largest oil importer, began purchasing Russian crude, heavily discounted following Western sanctions, in rupees and dirhams. Indian refineries, which had historically settled all oil purchases in dollars, quietly restructured their payment systems to accommodate non-dollar settlements. By mid-2023, India was purchasing approximately 1.8 million barrels of Russian oil per day, almost none of it settled in US currency. BRICS, the coalition of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, held its landmark Johannesburg summit in August 2023. The summit expanded BRICS membership to include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Argentina. The expanded bloc now represents approximately 46% of the global population and over 37% of global GDP, measured by purchasing power parity. A common BRICS currency framework was formally placed on the summit agenda, though no final agreement was reached on its structure or timeline. These are not rumors. These are documented, reported, confirmed events. What side A argues? The de-dollarization case. Nations driving de-dollarization argue that the weaponization of the dollar, demonstrated most dramatically by the freezing of Russian reserves in 2022, has made dollar dependency an unacceptable sovereign risk. The argument is straightforward. If the United States can freeze $300 billion in sovereign reserves belonging to a G20 nation, then no government can regard dollar holdings as genuinely secure. From Beijing's perspective, this risk is existential. China holds approximately $3.1 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, a significant portion of which is denominated in dollar-linked assets. In the event of a conflict over Taiwan, a scenario that US and Chinese military planners both actively model, those reserves could theoretically be frozen within hours. The incentive to reduce that exposure is not ideological. It is coldly strategic. Russia's position is more immediate, entirely cut off from the SWIFT financial messaging system, and with its sovereign reserves frozen, Moscow has had no choice but to accelerate non-dollar trade. Russian oil is now sold primarily in yuan, rupees, and rubles. The experience has functioned, from the perspective of other non-Western governments, as a live demonstration of what dollar weaponization looks like in practice. What side B argues? The dollar resilience case. The counter-argument, advanced by the US Treasury, mainstream Western economists, and a significant body of academic research, is equally serious and should not be dismissed. The dollar's dominance, they argue, rests not merely on the petrodollar agreement, but on the depth, liquidity, and institutional reliability of U.S. financial markets. The U.S. Treasury market remains the largest, most liquid sovereign debt market in the world. In moments of genuine global crisis, including the COVID-19 pandemic, the 2008 financial crisis, and the 2020 market crash, global capital consistently fled toward the dollar, not away from it. The euro, despite decades of integration, has not displaced the dollar. The yuan, despite China's economic scale, remains a managed currency subject to capital controls, a fundamental structural barrier to its adoption as a global reserve asset. Nations holding yuan cannot freely convert, invest, or repatriate those holdings in the way dollar reserves can be deployed. This limitation is not trivial. It is the central reason why, despite all the de-dollarization activity of recent years, the dollar still accounts for approximately 58% of global foreign exchange reserves, down from 71% in 2001, but still overwhelmingly dominant. The key uncertainties. What remains genuinely uncertain is the pace and endpoint of this transition. Is the world witnessing the beginning of a managed, decades-long erosion of dollar dominance, or a more acute and accelerating shift whose consequences will arrive faster than most institutions are prepared to handle? That question does not yet have a definitive answer. What it has is evidence pointing in both directions, and a set of strategic decisions being made right now, in real time, by governments and central banks whose choices will determine which trajectory prevails.